Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about how in the 17th century, Galileo Galilei used the recent invention of the telescope to refute key, long standing Aristotelian and Ptolemaic beliefs about the solar system. Before we jump into his refutations, there are a few important facts about Aristotle and Ptolemy's views that we need to establish. Now, Aristotle, who lived from 384 BC to 322 BC, maintained that there was a very important distinction between the so called superlunary and sublunary realms. Superlunary literally means above the moon, and sublunary means the opposite, below the moon. And the idea is that the cosmos is divided into these two realms. We humans live in the sublunary realm where there are four elements: earth, air, fire, water. Each of these elements has its own natural direction. Earth and water naturally go down, and fire and air naturally go up. But in the superlunary realm, the realm above the moon, the four elements don't exist. Instead, there's only ether, the fifth element, and ether's natural direction is to move in perfect circles. For that reason, the motions of the heavenly bodies that Aristotle thought we see were perfect circular motions. These motions belong to heavenly bodies because they're made of ether. So he thought. Later in antiquity, there was Ptolemy. Now, Ptolemy is writing much later than Aristotle, as I just said. He was writing in the second century AD. He lived from about 100 AD to 170 AD. And Ptolemy is justly famous for having created the only mathematically consistent geocentric model of the solar system. Every other attempt to put the Earth at the center of the solar system ran into serious mathematical problems. Throughout the medieval period, the Catholic Church had come to adopt the Ptolemaic model of the solar system, which in turn had borrowed large parts of Aristotle's views. And as I said at the beginning of this episode, Galileo used this telescope in the 17th century to refute these Ptolemaic and Aristotelian views. And by doing so, he got himself into serious trouble with the church. The telescope had been invented in the Netherlands in the early 1600s, and within a year or two of its invention, Galileo was using it. Now, he put it to a slightly different use than the Dutch, who had used it to study things from far away from them, but on land and at sea. Galileo wanted to point it towards the stars, and he published the results first in his book, The Starry Messenger, published in 1610, and The Letters on Sunspots, published in 1613. Aristotle, and following him Ptolemy, had been convinced that the superlunary realm was entirely different from the sublunary realm. This realm, entirely made of ether, after all, none of the four elements were present, only the fifth element, ether, was. This world entirely made of ether was incorruptible and perfect. But that isn't the world that Galileo observed in the telescope. For instance, telescopic observations confirm that the moon is a rock filled with craters and mountains. That isn't what an ethereal body should look like at all. The moon's topography is far too terrestrial to have been incorruptible. And in the letters on sunspots, Galileo was adamant that the existence of sunspots, confirmed by looking through a telescope, refutes the idea that the sun is perfect and flawless. Sunspots are blemishes that just would not be possible if Aristotle were right. And yet, there they were. Now, Galileo also believed that his observations showed that geocentrism, the belief that that Earth was at the center of the cosmos, was false. He thought that his observations could refute geocentrism. No matter how admirable Ptolemy's achievements were in creating a mathematically consistent model of the solar system as geocentric, no matter how admirable they were, still geocentrism was false, Galileo thought. The Earth simply is not the center of the solar system. In antiquity, there was another person, Aristarchus of Samos, who lived in the 3rd century BC, and he had defended heliocentrism, which is the view that the sun is the center of the solar system. Now, we don't know exactly how Aristarchus supported this belief, since his views are merely reported by someone else, namely Archimedes, another 3rd century BC thinker. So Archimedes just told us what Aristarchus had concluded. He didn't really present us with his reasoning. And much, much later, there was Nicholas Copernicus, who lived from 1473 to 1543, and he had defended heliocentrism. But Copernicus's views weren't really taken as decisive. His reasoning was riddled with problems that he couldn't resolve without the telescope. There were objections he just couldn't answer. But Galileo believed that he could answer them, and he thought that his observations vindicated Copernicus. And he made it very explicit that he was taking Copernicus's position. It's not a coincidence that the Starry Messenger was the first work in which Galileo publicly and explicitly sided with Copernicus, and that its results were reached with the telescope. Let's consider an example. If you believe, like Copernicus did, that the Earth revolved around the sun, then what might you say about the moon? Now, of course, we know that the answer is that the moon revolves around the Earth, not the sun. Of course, the Earth itself revolves around the sun, but centuries ago, it wasn't obvious that it was possible for celestial bodies to revolve around different things. Can the Earth really revolve around the sun? Well, the moon revolves around the Earth? Now, that's a difficult question, but it was one you didn't have to answer if you followed the Ptolemaic model, right? If you believed in a geocentric model of the solar system, then everything revolves around the Earth, sun and moon. But if you were Copernicus and you were trying to overthrow that model, you had to figure that out. Could one body revolve around another? Well, that second body revolves around a third thing. That's a question you need to answer. And the telescope helped to answer that because it was used to decisively establish that not everything had to revolve around the center of the solar system, which is the sun. So how did the telescope help with that? Well, Galileo used the telescope to discover that 4 moons, or satellites, revolved around Jupiter. This showed that it was possible for one thing to orbit a planet, while the planet in turn revolved around the sun. Thus, the question that Copernicus could not answer was answered, and some degree of plausibility was added to the heliocentric view of the solar system. As I said much earlier, Galileo's work on this question got him into trouble with the church. Let's talk about how that happened. Now, there are passages in the Bible that had led the church to conclude that the earth stays still while the sun and moon revolve around it. For instance, in the book of Joshua, it's written that the sun stood still and the moon stayed in place until the nation of Israel had defeated its enemies. That's Joshua 10:13. In other words, God made the sun and moon be stationary until Israel had won its fight. This passage was interpreted to mean that the sun and moon are typically in motion around the earth. The church had come to adopt the position that geocentrism was true and that reality was described by Ptolemy's model of the solar system. The church had not had a problem with Copernicus, not least of all because his views were immediately beset by challenges and objections that he couldn't answer, but also because the church was not going through the difficulties brought upon it by the Protestant Reformation at the time of Copernicus's writing. But by the time of Galileo's life, the situation for the Catholic Church had changed completely. In 1603, one of the earliest scientific communities, the Academy of Lynxes, had been started. The founders of this community had thought of the lynx as an animal able to see in the dark and therefore perceive things not visible to other people. It was an apt animal to choose as a mascot because the Academy of Lynxes was designed as a community aimed at discovering the truth, even if it challenged religious propriety. Galileo was a member. The problem is that the intellectual environment that was developing was not friendly to the Academy of the Lynx's approach to research. Now, Galileo knew that he might have been barking up a very dangerous tree. So in 1615, in his letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, Galileo lays out two principles that he used to make his views more palatable to Christianity. The first is the so-called principle of accommodation. This principle was invented by Augustine, who was a thinker living from 354 to 430 AD. It says that the Bible was written in a way that accommodates the beliefs and limited knowledge of its initial audience. People in the days of Joshua just didn't know that the earth was in motion around the sun. And so the book of Joshua was written in a way that accommodated their false beliefs. It's what was intelligible to its original audience, and that's what matters. A book written in a time when people knew about heliocentrism would reveal the same underlying truth, but in a language that was consistent with heliocentrism instead of a language that gives the impression of geocentrism. Now, the principle of accommodation is an incredibly powerful explanatory principle. As an interpretive framework, it provides us with the ability to explain many different passages in the Bible. For example, there are passages about God having fingers, hands, or human emotions such as jealousy. These descriptions are not true, but they're written in a way to accommodate people who find it easier to think about bodies, actions, and motivations this way. And the second interpretive principle that Galileo laid down as one helpful for him and for this purpose is the view that while the Bible is right about spiritual matters, it just isn't the authority on other things, such as astronomy or cosmology. Our interpretations of the Bible shouldn't give us ideas about what the natural world is like. Now, while Galileo's attempt to defend himself might have worked earlier in European history, it came at the wrong time for him. Because as he was writing to the Grand Duchess Christina, Europe was teetering on the edge of the 30 Years' War, which broke out just a few years later. It lasted from 1618 to 1614. And the church's counter-Reformation movement that had begun with the Council of Trent precluded Galileo's attempt to defend himself. That's because in the Council of Trent, which lasted from 1545 to 1563, the church had more or less warned people not to interpret the Bible on their own, especially not in a way inconsistent with the formal teachings of the church. For instance, the Council of Trent held that, and I'm quoting now, no one relying on his own judgment and distorting the sacred scriptures according to his own conceptions shall dare to interpret them contrary to the sense which Holy Mother Church, to whom it belongs to judge their true sense and meaning, has held and does hold, or even contrary to the unanimous agreement of the fathers. End quote. This pronouncement doomed Galileo's attempt to defend himself. Sure, He could appeal to some principles to justify his interpretations, but the fact remains that he disagreed with the formal teachings of the church, and that's a pretty big problem. This was confirmed in 1616 when a church committee considered Copernicus's heliocentrism in light of the Inquisition that the church had formed to root out heresies. The Inquisition had found that the idea that the sun was the center of the solar system was absurd, false, and contrary to the church's teaching of the Bible. That meant it was a formal heresy. As a result, Galileo was personally summoned by Cardinal Robert Bellarmine and told not to affirm or defend Copernicus's views. In 1543, when Copernicus's book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres was published, it hadn't received much attention. Now that its views had received some plausibility due to telescopic observations, it was suspended from publication until it could be corrected, in quotation marks. In 1623, Pope Urban VIII was elected. In 1624, Galileo met Urban VIII many times to discuss the state of his research, and the Pope instructed him that he could talk about Copernican theories, but only as one possibility among many. He could discuss it, but not affirm it. In 1632, Galileo published his text, The Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. Unfortunately for him, this text was interpreted by the church as having violated the rule that he could not affirm Copernicus's theory. This text was a dialogue between three characters, an Aristotelian, a Copernican, and a common person. The Aristotelian was named Simplicio, and there had indeed been an ancient philosopher named Simplicius who was an Aristotelian, so the name made sense. However, it also suggested simple-mindedness. Readers got the impression that Copernicus's theory was being elevated and affirmed, that naming his interlocutor Simplicio had suggested that the opposing view was a simple-minded one. And in fact, worse for Galileo, Simplicio's character voiced an argument that the Pope himself had given Galileo, namely the argument that since God could move the heavenly bodies in any number of ways, it wasn't up to humans to decide how the planets were being moved. And so it sure looked like Galileo was calling geocentrists and even the Pope himself simple-minded. And this was a very bad time for Galileo to be staunch in his views. The Pope was switching the Vatican support from the French to the Spanish during the ongoing 30 Years' War. He couldn't have people disagreeing with him and outright disobeying his orders, as Galileo was doing, or apparently doing, by affirming Copernicus's theory. So in 1633, Galileo was sentenced by the Inquisition. His sentence was initially imprisonment, but eventually it was lessened to house arrest, and he had to recite Psalms frequently as part of his penance. What began as a heroic and revolutionary refutation of Aristotle and Ptolemy ended with his house arrest. According to tradition, he was alleged to have said, "And yet it moves." This perhaps true or perhaps apocryphal story captures the idea that it didn't matter what the church was saying, and it didn't matter what the Inquisition had tried to suppress. The earth still moves. And that's the story of how Galileo used the telescope to refute key and long-standing Aristotelian and Ptolemaic beliefs, and how in the process he got in trouble with the church. Thank you very much.